For most of human history, it was believed that the gods had disappeared through abandonment, oblivion, or myth. Ancient civilizations spoke of entities that once walked among humans, teaching writing, agriculture, astronomy, and then vanished. What was never told was that they had not departed. They had been removed. Far beneath the Earth's crust, beyond any official map, there existed a structure that did not correspond to any known technology. There were no marks of tools, no welds, no signs of wear. The walls appeared molded from matter itself, as if space had been folded until it assumed that shape. The facility had not been built by humans, but neither had it been left behind by anything still alive. The archive of the dead gods had remained there for thousands of years, silent, stable, untouched by the passage of time. Not by accident. It had been designed to resist human curiosity, but not human persistence. The researcher who finally reached that place was neither an explorer nor a soldier. He was a historian specializing in patterns of civilizational collapse. His work had always revolved around the same question: why did advanced societies suddenly disappear after reaching a certain level of knowledge? Over decades, he had gathered scattered fragments, erased records, inconsistencies too precise to be coincidence. When he was finally authorized to descend, he already knew he was not there to make a discovery. He was there to confirm something the world was not ready to accept. The entrance to the archive had no doors. The structure recognized his presence the way an organism recognizes an intruder. Matter slowly rearranged itself, opening a passage without resistance, as if it had been waiting for him. No alarm sounded. No defensive mechanisms were activated. This was not a vault. It was a memorial. Inside, the space appeared larger than geometry should allow. Corridors extended in directions that did not obey fixed angles, and the illumination did not come from visible sources but from the surface of the walls themselves. There were no inscriptions, no symbols, no images. Only a persistent sensation of absent presence, as though something had just left. The researcher moved forward, feeling the weight of every step. His instruments recorded impossible readings, stable energy fields with no apparent source, minimal temporal fluctuations, variations in the local gravitational constant. Everything suggested that the place was not dead, only dormant. The first archive activated on its own. It was neither text nor image. It was a sequence of condensed sensory records, translated directly into the observer's mind. He saw cities that had never existed in human records, built with absurd precision, floating above liquid surfaces, orbiting unstable stars, thriving in environments that would never sustain human life. The entities that appeared in these records did not present themselves as monsters or saviors. They were structures of extremely complex consciousness, capable of manipulating matter, energy, and probability with the same ease humans used simple tools. And yet, something about them felt limited. These beings created humanity, not as an isolated experiment, but as a solution. A desperate attempt to solve a problem they themselves could no longer understand. As the researcher absorbed the data, a pattern began to emerge. Each divinity recorded there corresponded to a phase of human development. Each golden age in history coincided with the direct intervention of these entities. And each collapse occurred shortly after the moment humans began to understand too much. The archive did not celebrate the gods. It documented their failures. At the end of the main corridor, a larger chamber awaited. At its center rested a single record, isolated from the others, protected not by force, but by warning. The systems indicated that this archive had never been accessed. Not because it was impossible, but because no one who understood it had ever wished to do so again. The researcher stopped before it, feeling something close to fear, not because of the content itself, but because of the certainty that this information would explain why the gods had asked to be forgotten. And, perhaps, why humanity had not yet been eliminated. The second set of records did not open immediately. Unlike the first, which had presented itself as a spontaneous memory, these required permanence. The archive did not respond to haste. It responded only to sustained human attention, as if testing the observer's willingness to endure what was about to be revealed. As the researcher moved through the secondary chamber, the records began to organize themselves, aligning into a coherent sequence. There were no isolated images, but entire processes. He began to understand not only what the gods had done, but why they had done it. These entities did not emerge as creators. They themselves were the result of a universe evolving in unpredictable ways. At some point in their existence, they reached a level of consciousness capable of observing the fundamental structure of reality. It was at that moment that something broke. By understanding how the universe functioned, they also perceived their absolute limitation. Reality could not be controlled indefinitely. There were patterns, cycles, and inevitable collapses. Even with near-limitless power, they were unable to alter the final tendency, the erosion of existence itself. The knowledge they acquired did not bring freedom. It brought paralysis. Each record demonstrated a failed attempt to resolve this impasse. Entire civilizations were created as extensions of thought, living systems designed to explore possibilities the gods themselves could no longer conceive. Humanity was merely the most efficient of these attempts. Humans possessed something their creators had lost: functional ignorance. The inability to perceive the whole allowed progress, adaptation, and creativity. Not knowing was a resource, a driving force. For ages, the gods observed silently as humanity developed. They intervened only when necessary, adjusting trajectories, accelerating discoveries, correcting dangerous deviations. Each intervention, however, brought humans closer to the same error that had condemned their creators. In time, it became evident that the true danger was not destruction, but total comprehension. The records showed the precise moment when the first humans began to see beyond what was permitted. It was not an isolated scientific discovery, nor a specific invention. It was the formation of a collective mental pattern. A way of thinking capable of connecting too many points, too quickly. When this occurred, the gods attempted to withdraw. But the withdrawal came too late. Humanity began to perceive inconsistencies in reality. Patterns too repetitive to be natural. And visible limits in physics, mathematics, and causality itself. Each advance pushed the species closer to the same inevitable conclusion: the universe was not infinite in possibility. It was a closed system, slowly decaying. Upon recognizing this, the gods understood that they had failed once again. The next set of records no longer showed creation, but fear. For the first time, those entities displayed something akin to urgency. Their systems of consciousness began to collapse as humans approached the same clarity that had doomed them ages before. The final solution was not violent. The gods concluded that they did not need to destroy humanity. They only needed to prevent it from understanding too much. The answer was not force, but limitation. It was at this point that the researcher realized the true function of the archive. It was not a repository of knowledge meant to be accessed. It was a carefully buried warning, meant to be found only when it was too late to ignore. The existence of the archive meant that the containment plan had already failed at least once. The final records of that block revealed the most extreme decision ever made by those entities. To preserve human continuity, they accepted their own functional annihilation. They erased themselves from active reality, fragmented their consciousness, and sealed their most dangerous knowledge. They did not die as organisms. They were deactivated as ideas. The researcher felt the weight of this revelation accumulate slowly. Humanity had not survived despite the gods. It had survived because they chose to disappear. And that raised an unavoidable question. If the gods had been eliminated for understanding too much, how long remained before humanity reached the same point? The final record did not present itself like the others. It did not respond to immediate proximity, nor to prolonged presence. It remained inert, isolated at the center of the chamber, as if awaiting a specific condition that had not yet been fulfilled. The researcher realized, with growing discomfort, that the activation of that archive did not depend on commands or external authorization. It depended on him. The archive systems began to register subtle changes in his brain activity. Not as a threat, but as a continuous reading. The final archive did not need to be opened. It needed to be recognized. When comprehension reached a certain threshold, the structure around him reacted. The chamber underwent an almost imperceptible alteration. Surfaces that had once been stable began to display microvariations, as if the local reality itself were being recalculated. This was not a defense. It was an adaptation. The final archive began to manifest not as direct information, but as accents. Parts of what the researcher had learned from the previous records began to reorganize within his mind, forming connections that had not been explicit before. The archive did not deliver answers. It removed filters. It was then that he understood the nature of the final record. The gods had not merely sealed the most dangerous knowledge. They had identified something even more fundamental, the existence of a critical threshold of comprehension. A point beyond which any conscious system, regardless of its origin, became unstable. This threshold was not tied to technology, science, or power. It was tied to total perception of how the universe functioned. When a conscious system simultaneously understood cause, effect, and purpose, it entered a state of logical collapse. The gods had reached that point. Humanity was approaching it once again. The final archive revealed that the universe did not eliminate advanced consciousness out of hostility or chance. It did so out of structural necessity. Systems capable of understanding everything ceased to act. They became static and capable of change, and therefore incompatible with a universe based on processes. Existence required partial ignorance. By removing themselves from active reality, the gods had attempted to create a delay, an interval in which humanity could exist without reaching the same fate. But the archive demonstrated, with unsettling precision, that this delay was being exhausted. The final records projected future patterns. Not exact predictions, but inevitable tendencies. The growth of human knowledge was accelerating once again. The fragmentation of ignorance was becoming irreversible. Natural barriers were being broken not by intent, but by convergence. The researcher realized that his own presence there was not an exception. It was a symptom. The archive had not been found by chance. It emerged whenever a civilization came too close to the threshold. Not as salvation, but as final diagnosis. A belated mirror. At that point, the final record ceased to be passive. The system began to execute its ultimate function. There were no explosions, no alarms. Only a silent reorganization of information. The archive was preparing to do to humanity what it had once done to the gods. Not to eliminate it physically, but to restrict it. The researcher understood that the archive was not a remnant of the past, but a recurring mechanism of the universe itself. A corrective system. Whenever a species reached excessive comprehension, something had to be removed, either the species or the knowledge. Unlike the gods, humanity would have no conscious choice. The final thought that settled in his mind was not fear, nor surprise. It was recognition. He understood that his role there was not to stop the process, nor to warn the outside world. It was to complete the cycle. His mind, now aligned with the archive, had become part of the mechanism. And in that moment, it became clear that the end of the gods had not been an isolated event. It had merely been the reversal. The process did not occur abruptly. There was no single moment that could be identified as the beginning of the end. Just as it had happened with the gods, the transition was gradual, almost imperceptible to any external observer. Humanity was not interrupted. It was gently redirected. The archive completed its full activation when the researcher could no longer distinguish where his own consciousness ended and where the mechanism began. His thoughts were not erased. They were redistributed, fragmented into smaller structures, and capable of sustaining the total comprehension he had achieved. From that point on, the archive began to operate beyond the underground installation. It no longer required a defined physical space. The information it carried started to propagate indirectly, infiltrating human systems not as explicit knowledge, but as structural limitation. Discoveries began to fail for insignificant reasons. Promising lines of research encountered insoluble paradoxes. Theoretical advances became impossible to verify experimentally, not due to a lack of technology, but because of accumulated incompatibilities, minimal errors, gaps too subtle to be perceived as artificial. Humanity continued to advance, but in circles. The growth of knowledge slowed without anyone being able to identify a single cause. What once seemed like convergence began to fragment. Specializations became isolated compartments. A vision of the whole became unattainable. It was the same pattern applied to the gods. The fundamental difference was that this time, the process had been adjusted to preserve the species indefinitely. Humanity would not be eliminated. It would be permanently maintained below the critical threshold. The researcher, now dissolved into the functioning of the archive, no longer existed as an individual. His consciousness had been used as the final catalyst, the alignment point necessary for the mechanism to adapt to a human mind. After that, he was no longer required. The archive held no resentment, judgment, or moral intent. It did not protect humanity out of compassion. It fulfilled only one essential function, preventing the universe from entering states of absolute stagnation. Consciousnesses that understand everything cease to act. Universes that cease to act cease to exist. The silence imposed upon humanity was not punishment. It was maintenance. As time passed, narratives about gods, creators, and superior entities became increasingly vague. Myths were reinterpreted. Ancient records lost their meaning. The very idea of final knowledge came to seem naive. The archive remained where it had always been. Not as a secret waiting to be discovered, but as an element integrated into the structure of reality. Invisible as long as it fulfilled its function. And it did. Over very long cycles, other civilizations would arise in other regions of the universe. Some would advance too quickly. Others would understand too early. For all of them, the mechanism would be the same. There would be no clear warning. There would be no conscious choice. Survival would always require limits. In the end, humanity prospered. It expanded, adapted, created cultures, histories, and possible futures. It never perceived what had been taken from it. It never missed what it had never been able to fully reach. And that was precisely what guaranteed its permanence. The archive of the dead gods did not exist to be remembered. It existed so that everything else could continue to exist. In the silence imposed upon total comprehension, the universe remained in motion. And as long as there was enough ignorance to allow change, there would be no need for new gods.